In the early 2000s, Claire and her family moved into an old Victorian house in a small town in Maine. The house had been vacant for years, and Claire was excited about the large space. However, there was one part of the house she avoided: the basement. Strange noises would come from it at night, and at times, Claire would hear the sound of a child crying. One night, she decided to investigate. When Claire opened the basement door, the temperature dropped and the crying grew louder. As she stepped down into the basement, she saw an old rocking chair move on its own, gently rocking back and forth. Then, a small, shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the basement. It was a child, but its face was obscured by darkness. Terrified, Claire backed away, but the child's voice called out to her, asking her to stay. The figure vanished when Claire turned to flee. Afterward, Claire discovered the house's grim history. There was a child who had died in the basement many years ago, and her spirit was said to haunt the area. Jacob, a young man, rented an apartment in an old building in Chicago during his college years. The apartment was cheap, and he didn't mind that the basement was in disrepair. However, after a few weeks of living there, Jacob began noticing strange things happening in the apartment. Things disappearing, odd sounds at night, and a strange, oppressive feeling whenever he went near the basement. One night, Jacob's curiosity led him to the basement. When he opened the door, he felt an overwhelming presence. As he stepped into the basement, the lights flickered and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. He reached for his phone, but before he could turn on the flashlight, he felt a hand brush against his shoulder. Turning quickly, Jacob was face to face with a tall, shadowy figure. The figure had no distinct features, only a dark silhouette. Panicked, Jacob ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut. The next day, he spoke to a neighbor who told him that the building had a history of strange occurrences, and several tenants had reported seeing the same figure, a dark, shadowy man who only appeared in the basement. Natalie and her husband, Mark, had just moved into an old farmhouse in a rural town. The house was beautiful but old, and there were certain areas that had clearly not been updated in decades. One of these areas was the basement, which was cold, musty, and seemed to stretch farther than it should have. While cleaning the basement one day, Natalie discovered a hidden door behind some old furniture. The door led to a small, sealed room that seemed completely out of place. Inside, they found old furniture, but what stood out were the strange markings on the walls, almost like rituals. It wasn't long before they began to feel something was wrong. At night, they would hear knocking noises coming from the hidden room. One evening, they decided to open the door and investigate, but once inside, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. They found an old diary that belonged to the previous owners, detailing a strange history of occult practices and rituals conducted in that very basement. The knocking sounds increased, and shadowy figures began appearing in the corner of their vision. After a terrifying encounter with one of the figures, they decided to leave. The house was abandoned again shortly after, with no one ever staying there for long.